This is Senate Appropriations, and we're having further discussion on appropriations, and we have children and families and staff from the Agency of Human Services to give a more detailed presentation about their plans for a juvenile facility. In the budget, there is actually a request for funding for a detention facility. And so it raises questions about sort of that overall plan we still have, which has been a topic of much controversy and disagreement, certainly in the town of Newbury, in terms of how that proposal fits into your efforts to really get adequate system in place after the closure of Woodside. And as you're new to the commissionership, then one thing I think we would share is that we don't think that the actual closure of Woodside and what needed to be done after was as done very well, to be honest. And everything has been a bit ad hoc since then. So this is our desire to have you share with us where the department is now, the reason for your plan, a sense of the work that you're dealing with, the needs of the children that are in your custody. And with that, I'm going to have you introduce your staff for the record. And I see Shayla's here for the agency as well. So if you want to take it from there, and I see you have PowerPoint that we have put on the screen, so anybody who is observing this testimony can have access to what we're seeing as well. So,
all right, thank you very much, Senator, and thank you to the committee. For the record, my name is Chris Winters. I'm the newly appointed commissioner of the Department for Children and Families, day 22, week 5 on the job. And thank you for the opportunity to testify about a really critical need facing Vermont, which you're all very much aware. It's what we refer to as the high-end system of care for justice-involved youth. And joining me today are, on my left, Erica Radke, the Deputy Commissioner of the Family Services Division. On my right, Tyler Allen, DCF's Adolescent Services Director. Also in the room is Shayla Livingston, Policy Director for the Agency of Human Services. And over here, Katerina Lasias, Senior Advisor to the Commissioner. And as I said, I'm now in week 5 as commissioner, and as you all know, it's a very large department. With a lot of,
before you know everyone here on the committee.
I do know everyone here on the committee. I don't know if everyone on my team knows.
All right, why don't we go around and you can put a face and a name together. Andy.
I'm Andrew Birchlick, State Senator for the Washington District, so Washington County State, a couple of towns in Orange.
Dick Sears, State Senator, Bennington County, Wilmington, a bunch of towns in Wyndham County.
Jane Kitchell, Caledonia District, which includes the town of Newbury.
Rich Westman, and I represent the Loyal District.
And I'm Bobby Starr, and I represent Orleans County.
And missing is our pro tem, Senator Baruth, and then Chair of Health and Welfare, Senator Lyons. Oh, I imagine will be coming in shortly, so we'll get started.
Great, thank you for doing that. And as I was saying, you know that DCF is a large department with huge responsibilities to foster the well-being of Vermont's children, youth, and families. But as the brand new commissioner there, I'm really fortunate. One of the reasons I was willing to take on the position to have such a great leadership team full of experts, many of them who are here joining me today. And I'm going to give a very high-level statement and opening about the status of that continuum of care for youth in crisis in Vermont, but I'm going to defer to the subject matter experts when you have specific questions about that care. I think as someone who's brand new to this conversation, I can bring a little bit different perspective. I don't exactly know what was said at the Newbury public meetings. I don't exactly know what was said by previous commissioners or about Woodside when it was closed, or about when things went right, when things went wrong, or when they might have gone off the rails. I've been learning as much as I can as fast as I can in the last 5 weeks. about Woodside, about Newberry, about the high-end system of care. And what I can say is very clear to me is that we have a broken and inadequate system to care for the youth who need our help. And we need to fix that as soon as we possibly can. We're putting these kids in bad situations. We're putting our staff in inappropriate and sometimes dangerous settings. And we need to do everything that we can to get the treatment settings that we'll describe today up and running as quickly as possible. As a somewhat neutral observer, I realize I am the DCF commissioner and I have that perspective now after 5 weeks. But as a somewhat neutral observer who was kind of airdropped into this backcountry fire that was already in progress, I think I can bring a fresh perspective. I sincerely hope that folks can take a step back from what's become a very heated conversation and remember that we are talking about a treatment facility for crisis stabilization in a place like Newberry. We're talking about 6 boys at the most, boys ages 12 to 17 who are in crisis and who are in desperate need of help. These are our kids. These are our neighbors' kids. They live in our communities already, and we have a collective responsibility to care for those kids. We currently do not have the treatment programs and the buildings in Vermont to best address this need. And without appropriate treatment, these kids suffer. They don't have a chance to get better. And we're going to see them struggle and interact with state systems again and again and again. How the state and our partners provide these critical services for them, such as for these youth needing stabilization, needing treatment, it's an important question that we all have to grapple with. And with that said, I'd like to turn to our slides that we've given you here today and give you some background on the system of care and on our goals for treating justice-involved youth in need of care. And I'm going to give the first couple of slides on a very high level. And then Deputy Commissioner Radke will take over from there, and Tyler Allen will take over from there. It's just a handful of slides here to give you kind of the bigger picture of the high-end system of care. We delivered a report. I say that's the royal we. I was not with DCF at the time on Act 160 of the proposed high-end system of care plan. That was an updated description of the youth populations presenting the most significant system vulnerabilities in Vermont. It was updated information regarding the state's system of care and a proposed plan with descriptions of all of the projects underway to fill in the system gaps that we currently have. It also talked about partner engagement efforts and other recommendations. We have filed that report. If you have to look at the online version, you'll see a link there to that Act 160 report.
So the plan that you're going to describe for us today and the proposal for that 8-bed detention facility, which is a detention facility, is part of this plan that you're referencing here.
Which facility are you referring to?
Well, we have 2. One is the one that the treatment plan that has been proposed to be operated by Beckett at their property in Newbury.
Yes.
And that was, I don't know how many years ago. And then this year, there is a proposal for that 8-bed temporary facility.
Yeah.
And so is the 8-bed temporary facility part of the care plan that you're referencing here?
It is. I would just say that we have many, many pieces that we're moving forward at the same time because we don't know which ones will not fully come to fruition. So we need a lot of options on the table. We are pursuing a temporary facility, and I wouldn't call it a detention facility, Senator. It's a treatment facility.
The 8-bed?
It is secure.
I'm not talking about the one that Beckett would operate. I'm talking about the 8-bed that the funding is for.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that is part of our plan.
And you don't call that a detention?
We do not. Secure,
Short-term.
short-term secure crisis and stabilization.
Am I seeing 16 beds for secure closure? That's pre-pandemic.
Yeah, these.
What makes us think that we can get that down to 8 or 6? Excuse me, 6, not 8. 16 beds, pre-pandemic, 0 today. And I'm concerned that 6 is not enough. That you're gonna find kids staying longer as you seek placement. That was my experience for years at Depot Street when we ran a short-term program. Now it's all short-term and it's changed a lot, and I'm not sure exactly all the details, but I can tell you that for 20, 30 years, the biggest problem, as long as we were running a short-term program, was finding appropriate placements for the kids that were in the short-term program, which often led to them staying 60 days rather than the ideal of 10 to 15 days. And once you run into that with your 6-bed, because those kids are going to be really tough. I don't know how you get by without 16 beds somewhere in the system for
Thank you.
secure programming. So, I think that's where my concern about this plan being 6 kids is really worrisome.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. It's one piece of the plan. There's a larger plan and there are more beds planned. And
Okay.
this demonstrates the pre-pandemic and post-pandemic comparison, how we've lost a lot of capacity. And I defer to Tyler Allen here to talk a little bit more about the short-term and the long-term plan for increasing the number of beds and how many beds we need.
Yeah, and I'm happy to address that question specifically. So when we think of secure programming pre-pandemic, we're talking about Woodside. And Woodside was a program that had both crisis stabilization and longer-term treatment sort of co-occurring within one facility. I think our proposed system of care, which we'll talk about in the next couple slides, separates those two, has 2 distinct programs it envisions. So similar amount of beds between the 2 programs, but not in one facility that manages a mixed population.
You're the experts. I'm also worried about where you're going to find the staff. In this current environment, I don't know, do Newberry, that's 6 beds, and you got to have staff there who can deal with these kids. If you do somewhere else, you're gonna have to find staff that can work for them. And one of the biggest problems, I just got off the phone with an operator of a family center in Bennington. There's the workforce problems that they're seeing, and throughout social services, corrections. I don't know where you're gonna find people to staff these programs.
Workforce is always an issue, and it continues to be an issue. One of the reasons Newbury was
In
attractive.
all honesty, I think if you look back at Woodside, I don't want to look back too far, but there were staffing issues that created many of the problems. There were also leadership issues too. I don't want to suggest there weren't some significant leadership issues, but there was the way restraints were done ended up with a federal judge saying you can't send the emotionally disturbed kids to Woodside.
So that's what you've inherited as a new commissioner.
That's right.
And this is, and I guess the question then is helping us look, and that is as of now, but your plan has to take us from where we are now to where we need to be.
That's right, Senator. I know we have a lot of challenges to overcome with the history of Woodside and the way things were then. We carry that with us as we make our decisions now to try to solve the problem. There are definitely workforce issues that play into where we site new facilities. One of the attractive pieces of the Newbury project was that we had a willing partner ready to staff that facility. And as we look at other sites, we need to look at workforce and make sure that we can actually find the staff to run the programs once we stand up the programs. It would be helpful to go to the next slide and have Deputy Commissioner Radke talk a little bit about the current challenges to the high-end system of care. And then Tyler Allen will talk about the types of care that we're looking at and maybe clarify some definitions here a little bit as we have the conversation.
So again, for the record, my name is Erica Radke, and I'm Deputy Commissioner of the Family Services Division of BCI.
Okay, how long have you been in the position?
2 years now.
Two? With COVID,
Yeah,
it's
right.
wonderful you're here in person. It really is.
It's the first time we see you in person.
Yeah, usually I've been.
Yes.
So welcome. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just was wondering if you could. So you've got 2 years experience, obviously, with the challenges that the new commissioners coming in to help address. So thank you.
Thank you. And it's definitely been a challenge. And the slide before was showing just the reduction in our system of care, how we used to be pre-pandemic, and now we have about 50% less capacity that we're operating with as far as timing units. And I want to talk about the impact of the system as it stands now. So the impact and the lack of capacity in the high-end system of care is really most apparent in the youth that need stabilization treatment. And those are the youth that we'll be primarily focusing on today. Factors that lead to the need of stabilization include destructive or assaultive behaviors, mental health crises, placement disruption, concerns for risk to self or others, and also the likelihood of a youth running away. And I just want to note out, it's important that everyone sort of acknowledges that these behaviors are often in response to childhood trauma. So the impact on a compromised system charged with managing the care for youth with high acuity and needed crisis stabilization, it includes a greater need for supervision, which really reduces the program capacity and creates log jams in the system, and also possible disruption in program, which consequently reduces the capacity to address the needs of the youth in the program as a whole. So the impacts on the youth are really significant as well. Absent a short-term secure stabilization program, the department is really left to staff youth directly in alternative and potentially destabilizing settings. And this really also causes additional.
Talking about motel rooms with a social worker.
Not motel rooms anymore, but that had been in the past.
Not anymore.
No, not anymore. Prior to my tenure, we had been doing that. But we do end up staffing youth, sometimes in police stations, sometimes in emergency departments.
Monmouth County Sheriff is got.
And we do have a program called the Rest Stop that we're using in Wyndham County right now. But these sort of pop-up staffing sites aren't ideal for the children or for my staff. And really it causes a lot of stress and strain. So really our goal is to create a system that's really robust and a complete system of care that meets the youth where they are and in the most appropriate and supportive environments as possible.
And we talked about this continuum of care where treatment levels may differ and youth can move in and out of the various levels of care that are needed. And Tyler can speak to some of those different levels.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you so much to the committee for having me here and extending such a warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. I apologize if some of you have heard this a couple times. Senator Sears, I'm aware that you've heard a little bit of this a couple times.
So this is for justice oversight, is that where you?
Actually, well, judiciary, we also.
That's right. But this was the plan we came up with. This was included in that report that went out in December of what our proposed system of care, high-end system of care plan is. So we envisioned a 4-tier solution to kind of our most critical need at this point. Of course, needs always change. We're always looking to develop many layers of programs and services, both in the residential setting and other. But in this case, we're talking about specifically the residential beds that we're looking for and what they should look like for a healthy system of care. And this is ordered kind of, I almost want to say in intensity of acuity, but they're all have different functions. And what we're really focusing on is the first two on the slide here First is short-term secure stabilization. So crisis stabilization means that I take a youth who is at a point of crisis and my function is supporting them until they're stabilized. When they're in a position where they can start absorbing therapeutic intervention more purposefully, we can attach them to a longer duration modality to address their individualized needs. But it's really about providing stability, security, and safety to a young person at the point of crisis.
So it's not the 8-bed?
So this is what we're talking about with the 8-bed temporary facility potentially. We view this, and I'll get into it a little bit more in the next slide, but we view this as a form of treatment. Crisis stabilization in my mind is a treatment. I think some people think of it in terms of detention, and I think we'll probably should have a little bit of conversation around how those words become loaded and how they have meaning. But when we talk about stabilization, my need is to address any young person at any point of crisis immediately, because that's when we're going to have the greatest result from intervening and stabilizing them. The second, and in this case, when we use the term secure, we're talking about hardware secure, which means the building has physical locks on it that a person can't leave of their own volition. Because of that security element, only justice-involved youth can be in this environment, but I don't think we think of this as detention per se. We think about this as providing the security that is needed to stabilize the youth.
So on these secured, one is treatment, one stabilization.
Yeah.
Because of the Medicaid requirements, they're not eligible. Or
No.
are they under?
Neither of these programs would be Medicaid eligible programs.
Restraint.
There's a lot of factors that go into becoming a Medicaid reimbursed program.
Yeah,
Actually,
we went down that road and hit a brick wall. Remember that?
Yep.
Jane and Dick again.
Yeah.
well, that's actually
Unfortunately, when we closed Woodside, the thought was that Medicare was going to cover the portion of the cost of the secure facility. We did jump off a bridge.
Well, we sort of knew we were holding hands and down we went. And so I just thought I would have you clarify that in fact, these would not be able to be funded under the Medicaid PMI or treatment. What about the operated by Washington County mental health? That is their micro facility for youth. Is that a Medicaid eligible program?
No, not really. I believe those are PMI programs.
Oh, it's Shayla has the answer.
Sorry, Michelle.
Hi, everyone. Shayla Livingston, Policy Director for the Agency of Human Services. I think you mean the micro-residential programs run out of Washington County.
Yeah.
So that's part of the
That's what I
designated agency, and I think it is covered by Medicaid Global Commitment. I don't think that is one of their PNMIs. They think that is a mental health micro-residential with Medicaid coverage. Pretty sure. I can triple check that.
So
but-
would any of the youth in your custody be placed there? Potentially could be? If
The
that was
micro-residential
right.
settings? Absolutely, yes.
All right, I was just wanting to make connections because we did have a request as part of our BAA for the micro facility in
Yeah,
Washington.
that's right. We did.
And I don't know exactly where that's located, but somewhere in Washington County.
Can I help you with that one?
Okay.
I would like to clarify, so the first two on this slide, the stabilization and treatment, neither one of those are things we're envisioning as Medicaid reimbursable programs. I do also want to clarify that the security is not necessarily prohibitive of becoming a PRTF program. There are locked PRTF programs around the country, but it is PRTF is the fourth tier we have on here, and what the PRTF distinction is this is a Medicaid reimbursable program, and so that I think that's relevant because it's in the scope of this is what we identify as our healthy system of care, but that is a separate program from the one we're talking about when we talk about short-term secure treatment, which maybe is most closely aligned to what we're talking about with Newbury. How we envision short-term secure treatment, different short-term. When we talk about stabilization, optimally, we're talking about 10 days or less. Very short-term to stabilize. If a person is languishing in that kind of environment for a duration of time, that could set that milieu setting, that could be harmful to that individual, that youth in that kind of unstable environment with other youths turning through. We're envisioning for those youth who need to be placed securely for a longer amount of time because they have more persistent challenges, oppositional challenges, let's just say, that they could benefit more from a longer duration. We still call it short term because we're envisioning this to be like a 4-month-long program. There's many programs that serve youth that have kind of persistent legal challenges that are year-long settings or more. Our hope within our value schema within DCF is always to return a youth as quickly as possible to the community from whence they came, have them access to their family, have them access to community, and kind of develop up those strengths and skills at the same time. That being said, we know that some youth will need to have a greater period of time with their health securely while they get treatment. And so that's what we talk about with short-term secure treatment, and that's most closely aligned with the conversations that we've been having about. The two other I'll just touch on briefly, staff secure crisis stabilization. This is a type of program we have throughout the state. We mentioned Washington County Mental Health. They have a couple programs there that we consider staff secure crisis stabilization. It means that youth can leave, can push their way out that door. There might be a delayed lock on the door, but if a youth needs to leave and chooses to leave, they can do such. And if the staff are there to support them in making more positive decisions about staying within the program. Currently, that is our highest level of care in the state. So those youths who have a risk for maybe absconding or running or having violent behavior with staff or another peer, or have a significant legal risk or challenge to their community that they're trying to deal with, that's the level of care we currently be operating in. Why we have included this on the list is I think we believe there's a benefit to diversifying that programming. That's our most flexible level of programming, and we can kind of move youth in and out of those programs and closer to their community much more quickly. And so it's just a question of managing those milieux in bed. And so, for example, if I have one youth that has a very specific issue with another youth in that level of care, in that crisis stabilization program, but there's only one crisis stabilization program that has available beds, now I have to make very painful decisions about taking kids out of that care so that I can have these two youth, the reducing staff, or those hard decisions. So we want to diversify our portfolio, so to speak, a little bit, so we have more programs that we can access so that we can shift those milieux.
So where are your traditional group homes in the scheme here? Are they staff secure crisis, stable longer term? Or are you talking about, I'm just wondering where, for example, 204 Depot would fall in your system of care?
We envision 204 Depot as a staff secure crisis stabilization program. It's really intended to be ideally 30 days or
That's
less.
Sears house.
I know it's Sears House. So Sears House is then where you have greater risk and that is a pandemic facility.
That's correct.
All right.
The last is psychiatric residential treatment, which I spoke to a little bit before. There is now one psychiatric residential treatment program in New England. It is the one in New Hampshire that was just built in part of the Hampstead Hospital. These programs have a lot of requirements attached to them, as it sounds like the committee is well aware that there's a lot that goes into a PRTF, and it's why Woodside was found to not be an appropriate type of environment to be a PRTF facility, because there's a lot of there's a hospital component to it, there's a medical oversight component to it, it's driven by psychological process, and it was found to not be aligned with how.
So make a connection if there is one. We also have a proposal. We set it aside as part of the BAA, and that was Southwestern Vermont Hospital. had responded to an RFP to be an inpatient, so that it's not just the Brattleboro retreat. I guess that is coming in. That's something this committee's gonna have to look at, because that was a 9 million plus piece of expenditure to support the hospital and making the physical changes, et cetera. So would the retreat or this new facility then serve as the Vermont equivalent of the Hampstead Hospital? Could you just, or are we talking about a different population? And the only reason I'm connecting it is because that's another area where we have a budget request, and it's for youth that need inpatient psychiatric care. So when you said hospital setting, it seemed that there might be a nexus there. And the one thing about this committee is where everything sort of comes together and we see, something being asked for here or here. So would that be a resource to you? Or have you had discussions about how that facility, as it's envisioned, could help provide the treatment of the youth in your custody?
I'm not aware of, Shayla.
I think that one. Shayla Livingston again. So the SBMC project that you're referencing, Senator, is inpatient hospital psychiatric care. None of the levels of care that Tyler has described are inpatient hospital level care, including that PRTF there at the bottom is considered a residential level of care. That is a really important, so
it's attached to a hospital, but it's not inpatient?
So a PRTF is not.
Hampstead Hospital.
Oh, sorry.
My understanding of the Hampstead Hospital program, it was a disused portion of the hospital that they brought a PRTF program into.
So
it's
sort
not
of
a
like
hospital
what
per se.
Bennington is proposing, that space that's available that could be used for not inpatient treatment, but this other form of treatment.
We have a whole
So-
college that's owned by Southwest.
Oh, yeah.
So the Bennington SBMC project is inpatient level care. So it is still, it would be covered as inpatient psychiatric care in a hospital setting. It is not a PRTF.
Okay,
And
thank
we do
you.
need to really think about PRTF in Vermont, and you might hear about that next
Well,
year.
I'm just bringing it up as we're looking at this system.
Yeah,
and,
totally. Yeah.
Trying to see if there's something being pitched to it here. Okay.
So when we attach that to the 4 tiers of what we identify as needed, we're looking at the population of youth who have significant mental health challenges that we have significant placement with, but we're also looking at youth who have developmental challenges or intellectual challenges that that as they get older, they become less and less able to be managed within their homes or by their parents or grandparents or who's raising them. And then we've had challenges over the past 2 years of trying to place these youth or supervise them in an alternative setting when there is the chance of violent outbursts.
So would the
associated with their
Washington
needs.
County program that's not a psychiatric residential treatment, or does it fall in that bucket? I'm just trying to understand what we have in place and how it fits within this continuum.
We have on the slide that was shared earlier that had all the rates. Some of the Washington County programs, like there are 2 Washington County programs that fall into our crisis stabilization bucket, which is that second grouping. And then there is other ones that are closer to the mental health emergency beds. So they fall across a couple of those levels. None of those are PRTF programs.
They're lower acuity.
The acuity is immediate. They're I don't know that I would just say lower acuity, but I think there's certain, and I'm not the expert on all things PRTF in terms of what the defining criteria are, but PRTF programs as we use them across the country are more akin to year-long programs where they're getting more specialized treatment for a long period of time, and different PRTFs serve different needs. And so what we're trying to do is bring in a PRTF program that could meet some of the needs of DCF, DMH,
Maybe
and
an educational issue there as well. In the residential treatment facility, if you've got a child there for 10, 12 months, there has to be an educational component.
they all have educational components attached to them.
10 days or 15.
The
You got to
educational.
provide education after a certain number of days. I can't remember if it's 10 or 15.
That they have to provide education. I think that sounds right to me.
Sorry to make you go back, let's keep going. I'm just looking, any other questions before we move on? In terms of these 4 components within your system of care, and by high end, you're talking about children that really need more than the care and supervision that a foster home would be able to provide.
We can move on to the next slide. Would you like me to just keep going? So we just attempt to kind of differentiate a little bit some of the language that is used around here, because we have what is treatment versus what is detention. How does security play into that? In my mind, security can be applied to a number of different settings for different purposes, but a really important part of differentiation here is how we see detention as compared to treatment. And I describe crisis stabilization as a level of treatment. I describe more kind of longer term treatment is you're getting a therapeutic modality done to you. And how I differentiate between what is detention and what is treatment is that detention is driven by external factors primarily. We're awaiting a court case, we're awaiting adjudication or disposition, we're awaiting, there's something that's driven externally to the immediate needs of the youth, and the driver is to provide for the public safety, this youth where we perceive risk. DCF's orientation is kind of, I shouldn't say antithetical to that, because we're aware of community safety and the importance of that and what role we play regarding community safety. But our focus is with these young people. Our focus is how do we address their needs? How do we assess their needs, and how do we meet their needs? And so when I refer to these as treatment programs, it is about understanding and assessing what is the need of this youth and what setting are we going to best meet those needs, and how can we de-escalate that setting as quickly as possible, because all of the science goes to tell us that the closer we can bring young people to their families and communities, the more beneficial we're going to have. We recognize, of course, that people need to be removed from their families and communities for periods of time, particularly when there's a point of crisis. So I think we just wanted to talk about this because I think there's conversation, particularly when we're talking about a program like the treatment program in Newbury, where there's concern that this is a detention program, a detention facility. I think for some people, the thought of detention starts to turn into incarceration. It starts to turn into imprisoning youth. It starts to, and I've seen very often that it can become inflammatory as we think about how we are warehousing and imprisoning youth. And the mindset that DCF has really evolved to over the past decade has been to reduce the reliance on detaining youth and to increase our emphasis on treating youth needs rapidly and in the most appropriate environment to them. So this slide is really about kind of teasing out that language a little bit more so that we don't get hung up on some of the biases that we all kind of naturally carry when we think about youth detainment.
Questions?
I think we've got one more for you.
One more for me. Great. This slide is just called the approach. I think we've all 3 of us have spoken to these elements, but this is about understanding the youth that we're trying to serve here and how we understand the youth. The youth we generally are supporting, they've experienced trauma. They have significant adverse childhood experience, and they experience mental health challenges as a result. But for those of us familiar with working with youth who've been exposed to adverse childhood experience, exposed to either acute or complex trauma, we have the understanding that the response for these young people can manifest in ways that very much look like conduct disorder, that very much look like explosive behaviors, that very much can turn into reactivity, to running, to doing property destruction and harming. And if we view them as children that are that are predisposed towards being violent and being harmful, then we will enshrine them in that behavioral pattern. And if we view them as young people who are dealing with a very complex system of pain internally and externally, then we can start to help make sure that that doesn't become part of their kind of persistent pattern.
You know, I might just,
Of course.
they are violent, many of them. When they start hitting staff with frying pans, they're violent. And that's the problem is right now, we don't have anything at the top of the system to hold those violent youth. So I think, while I appreciate your approach, and I don't disagree with what you're saying, I think we have to keep in mind that these are violent, many of these kids are very violent and can do extreme damage to physical property, but more importantly, staff members and others and other kids. I've seen situations where the kids have been beaten mercifully. So that just increases that trauma that they're facing. So I think we need to really, well, I would love to think that every kid that comes in there is automatically going to stop that violent behavior. They're not, and that's where the problem comes in. You know, I had a constituent say to me, well, why are so many police at 204 all the time lately? And, you know, because I support the program, but I don't like seeing police there. I said, because of the kids that they have there, they're being asked to take care of some really violent kids. And when those kids act out, they have no choice but to call the police. And what the police do or what they don't do is immaterial to this conversation. I think it's important that we not sugarcoat the behavior of some of these youth. Whether it be on, we heard testimony in Senate Judiciary from some caseworkers, DCF caseworkers who, you know, violently assaulted or had to deal with these violent kids who were kicked out of a Depot Street program maybe, or some other program because their behavior was so out of control or in their own homes. So I really, I urge you to let's call it what it really is.
Well, I think with that, we need to be clear, and that gets into the security. It also gets into the number of residents in any of these facilities, because I think maybe the more youth and behavior that you have there to manage becomes, and then the other is the preparation and the training and know how to intervene with these behaviors. Because it.
De-escalation,
Yeah.
the restraint training, all of that.
And then that raises a question about how communities feel vulnerable, or how they feel that their very concerns are legitimate, or how they can be addressed. Because there are reasons why some of these youth come into your family, so to speak, into your custody, and how we acknowledge the reality of some of the high-end kids. Certainly, what may have been the genesis of it, and by the time kids come into your custody, there's usually a fairly significant effort to preserve the family, to see if there are lower interventions before you're going to be able to get a court decision to remove and give you the custody of the children. So I think some of that is how when you're deciding this, you do recognize the very realities that Senator Sears has discussed and observed, I'm sure, in your many years. and how you build that in, anticipate it, and how you mitigate it.
That's exactly correct in terms of having a treatment program that's trauma-informed and also has the ability to have outcomes that are measurable and also evidence-based, but still making sure that what we're talking about is a secure program where it's not static, you're actually hardware secure, where the youth aren't able to go out on their own. So, and I think that's where the balance is making sure the program has the treatment to address these needs, yet that the safety concerns of the community as well as the youth and the other youth in the program are still managed as well.
Other comments or questions? We still have a couple more slides.
Yes, and I think Erica's going to wrap up with the last few. Oh.
We
Yes.
sort of have an Alphonse Gaston moment here.
I know there's questions, I'll go over this one briefly. Really just want to talk about the definition of group home. 24 VSA section 4412(1)G governs group homes, and it's modeled after the Federal Fair Housing Protection and Public Accommodations Act. So the goal of these laws is to prevent discrimination in marginalized communities on the basis of disability. Title 24 recognizes that group home zoning must be the same as and no more restrictive than single-family residential zoning. And so it follows that a group home is really an essential part of Vermont's longstanding policy to serve disabled individuals in the least restrictive residences, consistent with the needs of individuals and the community.
Now, disabled, I think, has been a subject of question. I think people have different, just like detention, they have a different sense of what disabled might mean in context of the statute that you're referencing here.
Well, I'm not exactly sure how it's defined in the statute. I know it can be broader than what others may be thinking. Tyler, I defer to you, I'm not sure.
I'm sorry, I don't feel confident that I can speak to what the legal definition of disabled within the context of this conversation is. But I think that's something we can easily put together.
Well, in other words, you don't have to have a severe persistent mental illness diagnosis, I would assume, and within the context of what you're looking at in terms of your treatment facilities. That would be a child with that probably would be at the Brattleboro retreat, for example, for at least some of that treatment. I'm just, in other words, there, as I understand it, the community is feeling like we are taking children that are in your custody and you're labeling them disabled. And that is how you are reading the statute, and that's why you're pursuing the site that Beckett has in Newbury. But so I'm just trying to get some thought about what people might think of as disabled in that more extreme clinical sense, as opposed to what an accommodation might mean under this law. That's the only thing I'm getting at. Of course, Chris, you're an attorney, but you probably haven't given much thought to that.
No.
No, okay. Oh, we'll just keep going. I think this is probably something that, our own attorneys can help us with, because I think Ben has kind of looked at that statutory protection, but I raise it because it's been raised to me that that somehow you're taking kids who don't meet the definition, or the desire is to use that as the entree for the siting, and so it's something that we can just look at and understand a little bit better, but not necessarily today.
But I might.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think I've been misunderstood in some of this by people in Newbury based upon some of my emails one of the things that most worries me about the Newberry suit is if the Supreme Court, not Supreme Court, were to change this definition in group homes, we would have a mammoth problem statewide. So all the various agency, human services departments have a number of group homes for a variety of different individuals and statuses. They are designed to be small. This has allowed places like the Depot Street programs and to expand onto River Street. We had to get a special dispensation to be next door at 204 and 206 in the town of Bennington, but we were able to do that. But that would have a mammoth effect depending upon what the Vermont Supreme Court does. So, and I think there's been some misunderstanding from others about my concern about that being overturned or any changes the Supreme Court may look at.
And thank you for raising that, Senator. I was going to, and you made the point that this has greater implications for many of the services provided.
It's much bigger than Newberry.
Much bigger.
Much bigger than DCF, in fact,
That's right.
because we have other populations and people who are on the committee that may not have served on other committees or whatever, but we have individuals who are in the custody of the Commissioner of Mental Health or aging and independent living because of an intellectual disability that cannot be adjudicated, and they have committed sometimes very violent and very serious crimes, and they are in micro facilities, sometimes with 2-on-1 for the management of their behavior. So this is more just information for other members of the committee that may not have had a lot of discussion or haven't served on health and welfare or judiciary, but there's the Act 248 population, for example, and I guess that's, the agency can speak to that because you have the DCF piece, but the agency has got these other populations that where there is that connection to the issue upon appeal. Newbury obviously feels that it isn't an appropriate site, that it's a rural town, it's on a back road. Last year was a very muddy road, which seemed like it was a very horrible year. And of course, they don't have a police department and they have to rely on state police. So from their perspective,
Yeah.
that's why they question and strongly have concluded, and therefore it's a subject of appeal, which we're not going to attempt to, have you get into today.
Well, but that is the crux of the problem. If the court were to rule that a town without a police force, a town with muddy roads, doesn't have to have a group home, that would have a disastrous effect.
We
on
have
the
very
entire
broad
system.
implications.
That's my concern with that particular.
That's right. That's right. As I said earlier, it's an important moral question, it's an important policy question, but it's also a really important legal question.
Yep.
And while we would love to have a welcoming community, and when a community raises concerns, we have to listen, we have to respond. We need willing partners, but we also need to look to guidance from the judicial branch, where we think there's an important legal question that we need to advocate for, and that's what's happening here.
Well, maybe you need to speak to that, or I don't know whether Shayla wants to. Obviously, if you're the town that is feeling that you're being really subject to this request, and obviously there's, I believe at town meeting, I know there was town meeting, there was actually they passed a statement in they took a position that was voted on to oppose the facility, and so it is something that is obviously of very serious concern in terms of I would not say that if your goal is a welcoming community, that you would consider a town that's taken the position and has the intensity of feeling, and you're stepping in because they have felt, many residents have felt that that at some point it was, communities have the ability to pick or choose to be a site. There are times when I'm not sure, for some of these micro facilities, in fact, there's even, the reason that there was the open meetings with the town was because of the requirement that was put on by the Justice Oversight Committee. If I remember correctly, that they said you had to have a psychiatrist with your program, and you had to have meetings with the town. The view at that point was to look at the treatment program, and beyond that, it was those were the sort of the parameters that I remember. I'm not on that committee, so I'm only referencing.
Senator Lyons and I are, Senator Lewis is.
So that's where we are today. And I know that there are members of the Newbury community that are listening to this and have been following the work of the department and feel very distressed that somehow there has been not the understanding of what was said was that this was somehow the siting was something that was subject to the approval of the town. And to parse that out, I wasn't there, so I can't comment, but I guess if you could come back to why you're where you are and what you see, and from, as you have described it, and what you're looking at is what the statute and the reason for it and the implications of what's on appeal here, which I think Senator Sears has certainly
I
talked
agree
about.
totally with that. I just wanted to be clear that at times 204 Depot back in the day had 14 kids. So we're well above the 8 where we had that town. The town was okay with that. So I don't want people to think that, trying to protect something. Because we were a little different, 14 kids, we're well above 8.
6 here in this case.
Well, no, 8 is the law though, right?
Yeah, oh, yeah, the law, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
They're talking 6 kids in Newbury. I appreciate the challenge here, but it's similar to building the prison. The problem needs to be solved today, not 6 years from now, which takes time. So we need the interim facility quickly as possible. I thought Harry Chen said it well. It's akin to operating an ICU, not having something at the top of your system. It's akin to operating an ICU without doctors. So it's just, and I will say one other thing, then I'll shut up. My history of private corporations running the secure facility has not been very good. I look back to that Camp Iwanaki was supposed to be a secure facility, even though it was out in the wilderness. But the wilderness was supposed to make it secure. We didn't need a program. That's how we ended up building Woodside. And I think we should be very leery of private corporations running secure programs. It's one thing to operate staff secure programs, another to operate very secure programs. But, do what you will.
Beware, I guess.
I guess beware. I think it's a big difference.
Is that a fact in other states
Yeah.
as well?
I think you find other states have had problems farming out the secure type of juvenile facility, even though we're talking about small numbers here. We're not talking about the numbers like, Georgia or Florida or anything like that.
So from where we are now and looking, what you're saying is you believe that what is being proposed by Becca and their property, I mean, because they operate a variety of treatment programs.
So
and
they are
residential
a
programs.
known and a trusted partner, and there is, we do pay careful attention to the oversight of those programs, and perhaps Eric or Tyler can speak more to that if you'd like, to how we supervise those programs.
We do have the residential licensing and investigation unit that does go into programs regularly to monitor, how the children are being treated, are regulations being followed. And they're on a regular schedule to make sure that everything is going as the programs are being contracted to do, to take care of our youth. And also issues come up, residential licensing will go out immediately as well. So there's a lot of oversight to make sure that these programs are run according to the law.
So there, obviously, you're looking at sites and I'm sure that it's not been lost on you. There's been some discussion about should we in fact have more geographical connection or proximity between what right now you have the RFP, you got the response from Newbury, but as you go through in the process, you might be relooking at what you have for options and how you might want to reconfigure location relative to that, to the two different facilities, 8-bed and 6-bed. Assume that happened. Beckett operates group homes. They could be licensed, right? They have been licensed. They could, so say Vermont just says, well, we want to do more of a same location for the two programs. Then Beckett could, under Vermont licensing, they could say we're going to still run a program, but we will negotiate with another state that is looking for a treatment program for its youth in custody. They would, if they were licensed, they could do that.
Since they particularly thinking about in terms of Newbury, I mean, if we weren't still within our contract trying to work with them, since they do own that property, they might be able to then move forward to have a different use for it.
Which could include serving youth other than Vermont youth.
I believe that's like possible.
They're doing better. What used to.
Have kids from
The
other states.
Meg's girls' school was
New England school.
actually was more kids from Rhode Island and Maryland than were from Vermont.
All right. So, which makes this situation even somewhat more unique because we're talking about property that's owned. It's not state-owned property.
Right.
We're talking about an owner. No, it's not a private piece of property. All right. Well, why don't we finish up? You've got one page.
Yeah, we do have one more slide, more specific to Newbury. I have been out to the site. It's a beautiful property on the end of a long unpaved road. Just as a quick aside, I grew up going to my grandparents' camp on Round Pond in New Jersey, so I spent a lot of time in Newbury growing up.
Paul's Lake then.
It's a beautiful place, and so I'm still trying to wrap my head around how we got to this place that we're in, not knowing what was said, what was promised, what maybe shouldn't have been promised, what some of the back and forth was. So now we are in a place of, the town of Newbury and the Citizens for Newbury group filing an appeal after the district court said that this facility did meet the zoning and should get a zoning permit as its intended use as a group home. Those final briefs are due soon. And just to point out that the state is partnering with BPI, but BPI, as we just discussed, will own the property whether the project moves forward or not. And they may be able to use it for alternative projects if that's what they want to do, as with any private property owner whose property meets zoning requirements. This facility, this proposal is in keeping with decades-long policy of the state of Vermont to provide services in the least restrictive alternatives consistent with the needs of the individual. Tyler spoke to a lot of that. And last of all, the state of Vermont partners with designated agencies and other providers to serve vulnerable populations throughout many cities and rural towns in Vermont. It's often in small And in residential settings, that goes to what Senator Sears was talking about with small towns without police forces, towns with dirt roads. It's happening all over the state of Vermont as we speak. And so I guess I'd just kind of round it out with, we have a problem to solve. Many of us were not here for when Woodside closed, for when the Newbury project was proposed, for when the conversations with the community happened. But the reality on the ground is we are not serving youth in the way that we should right now. We don't have the facilities to do it, and we need to be all hands on deck. This is a crisis situation where we need to get those facilities up and running. We're pushing as fast as we can for the temporary facility, and in the meantime, looking at all opportunities and alternatives to putting up some of these other facilities and treatment centers that we need to fill out this continuum of care, to have the beds that we need, to have the ability to move youth in and out as needed. And we're working hard to do that. And Newbury is one piece of that. And I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about that, to have this conversation. I've learned even more today about the high-end system of care and the history and some of the other factors that we need to consider. Happy to have more conversations with any of you individually if you'd like. We're happy to pull that together and discuss potential solutions. This is a really hard problem.
The temporary facility would be, what's your estimated time that would be set up?
We're looking at about a year is what we're hearing from DGS and
And you
from the
have to
builders.
still cite that.
And still cite that. We're talking with the town of St. Albans.
And temporary for how long? Middlesex turned out to be longer than temporary.
Yeah, I don't know if either, like what the estimate on the time frame, but it's.
No, in terms of the life.
How long do we use it or the
Yeah.
life of the building?
Yeah, how long before, if it's temporary, by definition, it's gonna lead
Yeah.
to something else. How
Right.
long is it?
We're
anticipated
looking
to
for
be
something
temporary?
permanent, but we don't know what that permanent
But-
thing is yet.
So it could be 5 years temporary
Hopefully it's
or?
a lot less than that.
Okay, well, I
No,
just,
but
Yeah,
they're
hopefully
talking
you'll be.
5 years for a new women's prison.
After they do another
Plan for
study.
10 years.
we started 20 years. All right, well, I just was wondering if you had a sense of when something permanent would be brought online.
Hopefully shorter than that, and we're definitely sort of working on parallel tracks for both the temporary and the permanent, so that we don't end up in that type of situation where we're stuck in a temporary facility waiting for our beautiful permanent facility so we can move these youth over.
For the temporary, you're looking at St. Albans, right?
We are just, yes.
But that's in Swan, right?
It's a good question. I'm confused about that.
Well, I hope
think
you're
it
working
is.
with the right town. I think you mentioned St. Albans, you're working with them. I'm not sure that
I think
They're fine with it.
We seem to think we're in the right place.
Well, you may be, the town line's right there.
And maybe you have to do both. Huh?
Well, when I
It's
worked,
sort of like the Opera House in Newport, or Derby line and
When
Stansted.
I worked there, it was very confusing. Luckily, I only worked there about 12 weeks, but I went on to other places in the corrections department, but
After they released you.
after they. But it really wasn't sure what town we were in at the time, most of us thought we were in St. Albans and then found out it was actually in Swan. So just make sure you deal with the right town.
All right, well, thank you for coming in. Obviously, we're going to be looking at your request for the 8-bed facility. The other money is already just reserved for whatever ends up to be the fund plan. And welcome to the job. And
Appreciate it.
I'm sure we'll be having more discussions, obviously, as it relates to the budget. Senator Westman has been in touch, actually, and then I interrupted as,
Saw you were over his shoulder.
well, one never misses an opportunity to take advantage of getting questions or clarification. So as it relates to the budget, obviously, what we got from the House has added some things. And we need to hear from you in terms of if that would be where you would recommend if additional spending were considered, where you would put it. Oftentimes, as you know from our public hearings, the providers come forward and say what they would like, but we need to hear from you in terms of, is that really where the need is the greatest? I know you're the governor, you're gonna hold the governor's position, and that is, no, we can't support that. But on the other hand, you might be able to say, don't do that. If you're gonna do something, this would be what we would, think could get us better served. So we're kind of in that process. So we now have requests, I don't know, over 400, approaching 500 million of requests over and above the governor. So needless to say, there's much more in the request line than there is on the revenue side. And we want to make sure that that it's not a matter of what organization wants to provide or be reimbursed for, is that where we should put our first dollar. And that's really what this committee does all the time. Where would you put your first dollar? And so that's what we're trying to sort out. And but it's very hard in that public hearing process, because every entity that would like funding, and this year it's even more difficult because so much of what got started or could be funded with all the federal money's gone away, and what we can continue and sustain with our ongoing base once we unwind this slug of federal money is really the challenge for us. So we'll be hearing hopefully from you, and Shayla will probably come in and you may.
I think some of this too is, some of the world has changed since the budget was put together in November and December for the administration. And there are things like the supplemental food, it has come for 3 squares and those, and and we understand you have to live within the budget you created, but I think the central office and human services we may want to think about where you are and what that is, and talk about it. Because we're the last shot.
As Senator Westman said, we're kind of the tailpipe of the process.
We are.
I don't know if that's a compliment or not. I think sometimes not. Yeah, so,
Depends what comes out.
I know, and we try to, so I would just caution that just because the House put it in doesn't mean that that's where it's going to be, because we are going to have to look, and as of today, I'm still getting requests for more, 400,000 for this, and then we got, well, instead of 1 million, we need 3, and the list is just, extraordinary this year, and so it's a matter of what is sustainable long-term, and out of everything that we've created or what we have in place. We have a wonderful tradition of underfunding our core services and at the same time wanting to do something new. And so, or we want to defer an obligation to next year. So we'll do we'll partially fund it and then deal with it. And we have, and I will tell you that I've been around long enough, and Senator Sears and Senator Lyons, these 2 guys have been around longer than Methuselah, know that that is not the way you want to budget, because it comes back to haunt you. And this idea that somehow next year will be better is, I think, wishful thinking. I think nothing will be better than, in terms of available money, than what we've just experienced. And when it starts unwinding, the world as it used to be, it's going to be the reality for us. So anything, take a look at what's being proposed, and from the agency level as well, to give us feedback in terms of what is feasible, what is really more to the benefit of the provider as opposed to the individuals that you might be serving under your programs. And with that, I would suggest that we go off live and take a break.